40 years ago in 1969, Robert and Margaret Thompson bought a remote cabin nestled in the dense forests of the Colorado Rockies, seeking nothing more than peace and solitude away from the bustling city life of Denver. What they discovered decades later would unravel a mystery that had haunted the mountain community for generations, exposing secrets buried deep beneath the very foundation of their dream home. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps our channel bring you more stories like this one. The Thompson couple had spent months searching for the perfect retreat. Robert, a 45-year-old engineer, and Margaret, a 38-year-old schoolteacher, had saved every penny for years to afford their slice of mountain paradise. The cabin sat on 12 acres of pristine wilderness, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by towering pines and the haunting silence that only true isolation can provide. The previous owner, an elderly man named Thomas Crane, had lived there as a hermit for over 2 decades before his sudden death in early 1969. Local real estate agent Helen Morrison remembered the sale vividly, even decades later. The Thompsons fell in love with that place the moment they saw it, she would recall. But there was something about old Thomas that never sat right with the locals. He kept to himself, never came to town except for supplies, and there were always strange noises coming from that property at night. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, the closest settlement 15 miles down the winding mountain road, had whispered about Thomas Crane for years. Some said he was just an eccentric old man who preferred the company of wildlife to humans. Others suspected something darker. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy, built in the 1940s with thick log walls and a stone foundation that seemed to merge seamlessly with the rocky mountainside. Robert immediately fell in love with the craftsmanship, admiring the way each log had been carefully selected and fitted. Margaret was drawn to the large windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks and the small creek that meandered through their property. They spent their first summer there making improvements, adding modern conveniences while preserving the rustic charm that had captured their hearts. But even in those early days, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Margaret often complained of strange drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, especially in the basement area where Thomas had apparently spent most of his time. Robert attributed it to the age of the building and the mountain climate, but Margaret's intuition told her otherwise. She would lie awake at night, listening to sounds that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, sounds that couldn't be explained by settling wood or scurrying rodents. The couple's neighbors, when they finally met them, shared unsettling stories about the previous owner. Thomas Crane had been known to disappear for weeks at a time, his cabin dark and silent, before suddenly reappearing as if nothing had happened. Hunting parties had reported seeing lights moving through the forest at impossible hours, always seeming to originate from the direction of Crane's property. Most disturbing were the accounts from local children, who claimed to have seen people near the cabin, who simply vanished when approached, stories their parents dismissed as overactive imaginations until they heard them from multiple sources. As autumn arrived and the Thompsons prepared to return to their city home for the winter, Margaret made a discovery that would haunt her for decades. While cleaning out the basement storage area, she found a collection of old newspapers dating back to the 1940s and 1950s. The headlines told a chilling story. Local girl vanishes without trace. Search continues for missing hiker. Third disappearance baffles authorities. All the disappearances had occurred within a 20-mile radius of their property, and all had remained unsolved. That winter, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they had purchased more than just a cabin. She had bought into a mystery that stretched back decades, a puzzle that seemed to center on the very land they now called their weekend sanctuary. Robert tried to reassure her, explaining that mountain communities often had higher rates of hiking accidents and that people got lost in the wilderness all the time. But Margaret's teacher instincts told her there was a pattern here, a thread connecting these disappearances that no one had bothered to follow. When they returned the following spring, Margaret began her own quiet investigation, visiting the local library and speaking with longtime residents. What she discovered would change everything they thought they knew about their peaceful mountain retreat and set in motion a chain of events that would take 40 years to fully unfold. The truth was buried deeper than anyone could have imagined, hidden beneath layers of earth and decades of carefully maintained silence. Margaret Thompson's investigation into the mountain disappearances became an obsession that would consume her for the next several years. Armed with nothing but her teacher's research skills and an intuition that refused to be silenced, she began mapping the vanished lives that seemed to orbit their property like satellites around a dark star. The local library in Cedar Ridge became her second home during their weekend visits. Librarian Dorothy Walsh, a woman in her 70s who had lived in the area all her life, proved to be an invaluable resource. "I remember most of those cases," Dorothy confided during one of Margaret's visits. "The first one that really shook everyone was Sarah Hendricks in 1947. She was just 16, walking home from her job at the general store, found her bicycle by Miller's Creek, but never found her." Dorothy's voice carried the weight of decades of unsolved grief. Margaret created detailed timelines, meticulously documenting each disappearance. Sarah Hendricks in 1947, followed by hiking enthusiast James Morton in 1951, then married couple Frank and Rita Osborne in 1954, who had been camping in the area. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious, but Margaret's analytical mind began to see connections others had missed. Most disappearances occurred during late summer or early fall, when the mountain weather was still favorable for outdoor activities. All victims were last seen in areas accessible to someone familiar with the local terrain. More unsettling was the geographic pattern. When Margaret plotted the locations on a topographic map, they formed an irregular circle with her property at the approximate center. The radius varied, but none of the disappearances had occurred more than 15 miles from the Thompson cabin. Robert initially dismissed this as coincidence, pointing out that people naturally gravitated toward the more accessible and scenic areas for hiking and camping. But Margaret's research revealed something that made his rationalization impossible to maintain. Thomas Crane had lived in the area since 1946, just 1 year before the disappearances began. According to local records, he had arrived with little explanation of his background, claiming to be a veteran seeking solitude after the war. He had paid cash for the land and built the cabin with his own hands, rarely interacting with the community except for essential purchases. Dorothy Walsh remembered him as a man who seemed to carry invisible burdens, someone who flinched at unexpected sounds and avoided eye contact with strangers. "Thomas was odd, but we thought it was the war that changed him," Dorothy explained. "So many men came back different. We gave him his space, figured he'd earned the right to heal in private." But Margaret discovered that Crane's hermit lifestyle hadn't been as isolated as everyone believed. Old store receipts she found in the cabin's attic showed purchases of supplies far exceeding what one man would need: rope, tarps, lanterns, and most puzzling, extensive amounts of construction materials ordered over the years. The basement of the cabin had always bothered Margaret with its unusual layout and the persistent drafts that seemed to come from solid walls. Robert had reinforced her concerns during their third summer when he attempted to install additional storage shelving. His drill had hit empty space where there should have been earth behind the stone foundation. When they investigated, they found that the basement extended further than the cabin's footprint suggested, but the additional space appeared to be sealed off behind what looked like newer stonework. Robert's engineering background kicked in as he studied the foundation more carefully. The newer stones were different in color and composition from the original construction, and the mortar showed signs of being mixed at different times. Most telling was the discovery of what appeared to be ventilation shafts that disappeared into the mountainside, their purpose unclear, but their construction deliberate and sophisticated. Local sheriff's records, which Margaret accessed through a friendly clerk who remembered her from their school days, revealed another disturbing pattern. In every disappearance case, investigators had noted unusual disturbances in the ground near the victim's last known location, areas where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed and then carefully restored. These observations had been noted but never followed up on, attributed to wildlife or weather patterns. Margaret's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that 3 of the missing persons had been last seen speaking with or in the company of a man matching Thomas Crane's description. Witnesses described a tall, thin man with graying hair who seemed knowledgeable about the local area and offered directions or assistance to visitors. The descriptions were vague, given decades after the fact, but consistent enough to create a profile that made Margaret's blood run cold every time she descended into their cabin's basement. By their 5th year of ownership, Margaret had compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence that painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. But when she approached the local sheriff's department with her findings, She encountered the same institutional indifference that had allowed the pattern to continue for decades. The current sheriff, Jim Bradley, listened politely, but explained that without physical evidence or new witnesses, there was little they could do about decades-old cases. Margaret realized that if the truth was ever going to emerge, it would require more than documentation and research. It would require uncovering the physical evidence that had been hidden for so long, evidence that might literally be beneath their feet. The drafts in the basement seemed to whisper secrets that demanded to be heard. The Thompson family's relationship with their mountain retreat grew increasingly complicated as Margaret's research deepened and the implications of her discoveries settled into their daily lives. What had begun as weekend escapes from Denver's urban pressures transformed into tense visits filled with unspoken questions and the weight of terrible possibilities. Robert found himself torn between his love for the property and his growing concern for his wife's emotional state, while their two teenage children began to sense the undercurrents of fear that now permeated their family gatherings. Sarah Thompson, their 16-year-old daughter, was the first to openly acknowledge the change in atmosphere. "Mum, this place used to feel like an adventure," she confided during a particularly somber weekend in 1974. "Now it feels like we're living in someone else's nightmare." Her younger brother Michael, 14, had grown increasingly reluctant to explore the woods alone, claiming he felt watched whenever he ventured far from the cabin. The family that had once spent hours hiking and fishing together now found themselves gravitating toward indoor activities, unconsciously avoiding the very wilderness they had purchased to enjoy. Margaret's obsession with the disappearances had evolved from casual research into a consuming mission that affected every aspect of their cabin experience. She had converted a corner of the main room into an informal command center, complete with maps, timelines, and photographs of the missing persons she had collected from families and newspaper archives. The walls displayed a haunting gallery of faces, young and old, locals and tourists, all united by their shared fate of vanishing without explanation in the shadow of the Thompson property. Robert watched his wife's transformation with growing alarm. The woman who had once found peace in the mountain silence now seemed constantly alert to every sound, every shift in the wind through the pines. She had developed the habit of checking and rechecking the doors and windows before bed, and she insisted on keeping battery-powered lanterns in every room despite the cabin's reliable electrical system. Most concerning to Robert was Margaret's increasing fixation on the basement, where she spent hours listening to the walls and measuring spaces with a precision that bordered on compulsive. "I know something's down there," Margaret would insist during their increasingly frequent arguments about her investigation. "The drafts don't lie, Robert. The foundation doesn't lie. Thomas Crane built more than just a cabin here." Robert's attempts to rationalize her concerns grew weaker as his own observations confirmed the structural anomalies she had identified. As an engineer, he couldn't deny that the basement's dimensions didn't match the cabin's footprint, or that the ventilation patterns suggested spaces that didn't officially exist. The local community's reaction to Margaret's inquiries had shifted from polite interest to uncomfortable avoidance. Shop owners who had initially welcomed the Thompsons as new residents now grew silent when Margaret brought up the old disappearances. Dorothy Walsh at the library had become protective of certain records, claiming they were being reorganized or were unavailable for research. Even Sheriff Bradley, who had initially dismissed Margaret's theories with professional courtesy, now seemed irritated by her persistence and began suggesting that her time might be better spent on other activities. This community resistance only strengthened Margaret's conviction that she was approaching something significant. In small mountain towns, she understood, secrets were often shared burdens that entire communities carried together. The silence that greeted her questions wasn't the silence of ignorance, it was the silence of knowledge too dangerous to acknowledge. Someone, perhaps many someones, knew more about Thomas Crane and the disappearances than they were willing to admit. The family's financial investment in the property made selling it impractical, but the emotional toll of their weekends there continued to mount. Robert suggested taking a break from their visits, perhaps renting the cabin to others for a season while tensions cooled. Margaret rejected this idea vehemently, arguing that any interruption in her investigation might allow crucial evidence to be destroyed or removed. "They're waiting for us to give up," she insisted. "Thomas Crane waited decades to die peacefully with his secrets. I won't let that be the end of the story." By 1975, the Thompson children had largely stopped accompanying their parents to the cabin, preferring to spend weekends with friends or on school activities. Sarah later described those years as a time when their family retreat became their mother's battleground, a place where she fought invisible enemies and searched for truths that seemed to retreat further with every attempt to grasp them. The cabin that had once represented their parents' dreams had become a symbol of division and obsession. Margaret's health began to show the strain of her relentless investigation. She lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and experienced periods of anxiety that Robert attributed to the stress of her research. Her friends in Denver noticed the change, describing a woman who seemed to be carrying a terrible burden that she couldn't share with anyone who hadn't seen what she had seen, hadn't felt what she had felt in that basement, where the walls seemed to pulse with hidden secrets. The irony wasn't lost on Robert, that in trying to solve the mystery of people who had disappeared, his wife was slowly disappearing herself, consumed by a quest for justice that seemed to demand everything she had to give. The mountain that had promised them peace had become the stage for a battle between truth and silence that would define the rest of their lives. As winter approached in 1975, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would spend the entire cold season at the cabin, alone if necessary, dedicating herself completely to uncovering whatever Thomas Crane had hidden beneath their home. The mountains would finally have to give up their dead. Margaret Thompson's decision to spend the winter of 1975 to 1976 alone at the mountain cabin marked the beginning of the most intense and dangerous phase of her investigation. While Robert remained in Denver with the children, maintaining his job and trying to preserve some semblance of normal family life, Margaret embarked on a solitary quest that would push her to the edges of sanity and safety. The isolation that had once represented peace and escape now became a crucible where obsession and determination would be tested against the harsh realities of mountain winter and buried secrets. The first month alone confirmed many of Margaret's suspicions about sounds in the cabin that had been dismissed as settling wood or wildlife activity. Without the distractions of family conversation and daily routines, she could focus entirely on the subtle audio landscape of the building. The drafts in the basement followed patterns that suggested air movement through constructed spaces rather than natural gaps in old stonework. Most significantly, on still nights when the wind wasn't masking other sounds, Margaret began to hear what she could only describe as echoes, faint sounds that seemed to come from deep below the cabin floor, as if her footsteps were being repeated in spaces she couldn't access. Margaret's methodology became increasingly sophisticated as winter deepened. She created detailed acoustic maps of the cabin, noting where sounds seemed to originate and where they seemed to be absorbed or redirected. Using a stethoscope borrowed from Robert's first aid kit, she methodically examined every wall in the basement, searching for variations in density that might indicate hollow spaces. Her most significant discovery came in February, when she found a section of the north wall where the stone showed microscopic wear patterns inconsistent with natural weathering, patterns that suggested the wall had been constructed, dismantled, and reconstructed multiple times over the years. The physical demands of her investigation took their toll. Margaret lost 20 pounds during the winter, sustained numerous bruises from crawling through tight spaces, and developed a persistent cough from exposure to dust and cold air in the basement. But her mental state showed even more dramatic changes. Robert's weekend visits revealed a woman transformed by isolation and purpose, someone who spoke in urgent whispers about breakthrough discoveries and whose eyes carried the intensity of someone perpetually on the verge of a revelation. "I found the seam," Margaret told Robert during one of his February visits, leading him immediately to a corner of the basement where she had spent weeks excavating behind loose stones. "The wall isn't solid here. It's a facade. Thomas Crane built this to hide something, and I'm going to find out what." Robert's engineering eye confirmed that the stonework was indeed unusual, but he pleaded with Margaret to contact authorities rather than continuing her dangerous solo investigation. Margaret refused, convinced that official intervention would result in a cover-up that would protect whoever might still be alive and complicit in Thomas Crane's activities. Margaret's research had expanded beyond the historical disappearances to focus on Thomas Crane himself. Through painstaking correspondence with military records offices and veterans organizations, she had discovered significant gaps in Crane's official biography. His military service records were partially sealed, and his pre-1946 activities were virtually undocumented. Most disturbing was her discovery that Thomas Crane had been the name of a soldier who died in Italy in 1944, 2 years before the man using that name appeared in Colorado. This revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of the entire situation. The man who had lived on their property for over 2 decades had been using a stolen identity, which suggested premeditation and criminal sophistication far beyond what anyone had imagined. If the disappearances were connected to someone operating under a false identity, it meant the investigation had been doomed from the start, because authorities had been looking for the wrong person entirely. March brought warmer weather and Margaret's most significant breakthrough. While examining the basement wall she had been gradually dismantling, her flashlight beam revealed something that stopped her heart: scratches in the stone that formed crude letters spelling "Help Us." The markings appeared to have been made with fingernails or small tools, etched desperately into the rock by someone trapped behind the false wall. The discovery confirmed Margaret's worst fears and transformed her investigation from historical research into urgent rescue mission. Working with renewed intensity, Margaret began the dangerous process of removing stones from the wall where the message had been scratched. Each stone had to be carefully extracted to avoid causing a collapse that could bury evidence or injure herself. As the hole grew larger, the drafts she had noticed for years became stronger, carrying with them a stale, cold air that spoke of spaces sealed for decades. Most unnervingly, the acoustic properties of the basement changed as the wall was breached. Sounds now echoed with a depth that suggested cavities extending far into the mountainside. By late March, Margaret had created an opening large enough to crawl through, but her courage faltered at the threshold of discovery. The responsibility of what she might find weighed heavily on someone who had never imagined her weekend retreat would become the scene of a criminal investigation. Robert's visits became interventions as he tried to convince Margaret to contact authorities before proceeding further, but she remained convinced that premature disclosure would result in evidence being destroyed and justice being denied. The winter had changed Margaret Thompson from a curious amateur investigator into someone prepared to uncover truths that had been buried for 30 years. But as spring approached and the mountain snow began to melt, revealing paths that had been impassable during her months of isolation, Margaret realized that her solitary investigation was approaching its limits. Whatever lay beyond the wall she had breached would require more courage, more resources, and possibly more expertise than one determined woman could provide. The scratched plea for help had transformed the investigation from a historical curiosity into a moral imperative that would define the rest of her life. The spring of 1976 found Margaret Thompson poised at the edge of a discovery that would validate years of investigation and justify the tremendous personal cost of her obsession. The hole she had created in the basement wall had become a portal to something far more extensive than she had imagined. Not just a hidden room or storage space, but what appeared to be an elaborate tunnel system that extended deep into the mountainside. The stale air flowing through the opening carried scents of earth and stone, but also something else that made Margaret's stomach clench with dread: the unmistakable mustiness of spaces that had been sealed with organic materials inside them. Robert's arrival for the Easter weekend marked a turning point in the family's approach to Margaret's investigation. The physical evidence was now undeniable, and her months of solitary research had produced results that even his engineering skepticism couldn't dismiss. Together, they expanded the opening enough to shine powerful flashlights into the space beyond, revealing the beginning of what appeared to be a sophisticated tunnel system carved directly into the rocky mountainside. The craftsmanship was impressive and disturbing. Whoever had built this had possessed both construction skills and a long-term plan that spoke of premeditation and terrible purpose. "Margaret, this is beyond what we can handle alone," Robert admitted, as they stared into the dark passage that disappeared beyond their flashlight beams. "This isn't just about historical disappearances anymore. This is an active crime scene." But Margaret's response revealed how completely the investigation had consumed her worldview. She saw official intervention as a threat rather than a solution, convinced that authorities would either bungle the investigation or participate in a cover-up that would protect powerful interests she had yet to identify. Their compromise reflected both the urgency of the situation and Margaret's deep distrust of official channels. They would document everything they found before contacting authorities, ensuring that evidence couldn't be suppressed or misrepresented. Robert agreed to take time off from work to assist in the exploration, but only if Margaret agreed to contact law enforcement within 2 weeks, regardless of what they discovered. This deadline created an atmosphere of intense urgency as they prepared for an exploration that neither had ever imagined they would undertake. The tunnel system proved to be far more extensive and sophisticated than their initial glimpses had suggested. The main passage extended approximately 50 feet into the mountainside before branching into multiple smaller tunnels, some natural cave formations that had been enlarged and connected, others entirely man-made constructions carved through solid rock. The engineering required for such a project suggested years of work and considerable expertise, confirming Margaret's theory that Thomas Crane's background was far more complex than his hermit persona had suggested. Most disturbing were the discoveries that confirmed the connection between the tunnel system and the decades of disappearances. Personal belongings scattered throughout the passages told a horrific story. A woman's purse containing identification for Sarah Hendricks, the 16-year-old who had vanished in 1947, camping equipment marked with the names of multiple missing hikers, clothing and jewelry that represented nearly 30 years of victims. Each discovery was photographed and documented with the meticulous care that Margaret's teaching background had instilled, creating an archive of evidence that would be crucial for any future prosecution. The deeper sections of the tunnel system revealed the full scope of Thomas Crane's activities. Multiple chambers had been carved out of the rock, some clearly designed for imprisonment, with evidence of restraints and primitive sanitary facilities, others apparently used for storage or as workshops where Crane had crafted the tools and materials needed for his activities. The level of planning and organization suggested a criminal operation that had operated with impunity for decades, protected by isolation and a carefully constructed false identity. Robert's engineering analysis of the tunnel system revealed another chilling dimension to Crane's activities. The ventilation system was sophisticated enough to prevent the buildup of dangerous gases, and the drainage showed evidence of regular maintenance over many years. This wasn't the work of a deranged individual acting on impulse. It was a carefully designed facility that had been operated and maintained as a long-term criminal enterprise. The implications extended far beyond simple murder to suggest systematic kidnapping, imprisonment, and possibly human trafficking on a scale that neither had imagined possible. The most heartbreaking discoveries were the messages carved into the walls throughout the tunnel system. Victims had scratched names, dates, and desperate pleas for help into the stone, creating a record of suffering that spanned decades. Some messages were barely legible, worn smooth by time and moisture, while others seemed recent enough to have been carved during Thomas Crane's final years. The timeline suggested that Crane had continued his activities almost until his death in 1969, meaning that some victims might have survived for years in the underground prison the Thompsons had unknowingly purchased along with their dream cabin. As their 2-week deadline approached, Margaret and Robert faced the reality that their amateur investigation had uncovered evidence of crimes far beyond their ability to process or understand fully. The tunnel system contained enough evidence to reopen dozens of missing person cases and potentially identify victims whose disappearances had never been officially recorded. But it also contained secrets that powerful people might have reasons to keep buried, and Margaret's paranoia about official cover-ups began to seem less like obsession and more like reasonable caution. The decision to contact authorities marked the end of Margaret's solitary crusade and the beginning of a much larger investigation that would transform their quiet mountain community forever. If this case has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the channel bring more stories like this and helps Margaret Thompson's story reach more people. Sheriff Jim Bradley's reaction to the Thompson discovery would become a case study in how institutional inadequacy can compound historical injustices. When Margaret and Robert finally contacted the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department in May 1976, they expected their carefully documented evidence to trigger an immediate and comprehensive criminal investigation. Instead, they encountered a bureaucratic response that seemed designed more to contain the situation than to pursue justice for the victims whose remains and belongings filled Thomas Crane's underground complex. Bradley's first visit to the Thompson property revealed a man overwhelmed by the scope of the discovery and concerned primarily with the jurisdictional complications it would create. The tunnel system extended beyond county lines. Some victims were from other states, and the federal implications of what appeared to be a multi-decade criminal enterprise would require coordination between agencies that rarely worked together effectively. His immediate response was to seal the tunnel entrance and restrict access while determining the appropriate investigative protocol, a decision that frustrated Margaret, who had spent months carefully preserving evidence that was now being treated as a bureaucratic inconvenience. The state police response, when it finally materialized 3 weeks later, demonstrated the institutional prejudices that had allowed Thomas Crane's activities to continue undetected for so long. Detective Ray Morrison, the lead investigator assigned to the case, approached the evidence with skepticism that bordered on dismissal. His preliminary report, which Margaret obtained years later through Freedom of Information requests, described the discoveries as alleged evidence of historical criminal activity with questionable chain of custody and potential contamination by civilian interference. Morrison's investigation focused more on discrediting Margaret's research methods than on analyzing the physical evidence she had uncovered. He questioned her mental state, suggesting that years of isolation and obsession had led her to misinterpret natural cave formations and abandoned belongings as evidence of criminal activity. Most infuriatingly, he dismissed the carved messages throughout the tunnel system as potentially modern fabrications, arguing that desperate people would say anything to support their theories. This approach reflected an institutional bias against civilian investigations that prioritized professional authority over factual evidence. The victims' families, when they learned of the discovery through local news reports, faced their own frustrations with the official response. Sarah Hendrick's sister, now in her 50s, had spent 30 years wondering about her sister's fate, only to discover that evidence of her murder had been literally beneath the feet of weekend cabin owners for decades. "They treated us like we were bothering them by wanting answers," she later recalled. Here was proof of what happened to Sarah, and they acted like it was an inconvenience that interrupted their regular duties. Federal involvement came grudgingly, and only after pressure from families and media attention forced the hand of reluctant local officials. The FBI's jurisdiction was questionable since the crimes had occurred decades earlier, and the perpetrator was dead. But the interstate nature of some victims and the potential for federal civil rights violations provided legal grounds for intervention. Agent Patricia Collins, who led the federal review, brought a more professional approach to the investigation, but also the bureaucratic caution that came with a case where successful prosecution was impossible. The forensic examination of the tunnel system, when it finally occurred, validated many of Margaret's conclusions while revealing additional horrors she had been unable to document during her amateur investigation. Advanced equipment detected human remains in areas where Crane had attempted to conceal evidence through burial or chemical decomposition. DNA analysis, still in its primitive stages in 1976, would eventually identify victims from multiple states and time periods, confirming that Crane's activities had been even more extensive than the missing person reports suggested. However, the official investigation also revealed the limitations that had allowed Crane to operate undetected for so long. The tunnel system included chambers that showed evidence of regular visitors, suggesting that Crane had not worked entirely alone. Tool marks and construction techniques indicated that some portions of the complex had been built with assistance from someone with professional mining or construction experience. Most disturbing were indications that the operation had continued even during periods when Crane was known to be absent from the property, suggesting either accomplices or a network of criminal activity that extended beyond one individual. The bureaucratic handling of the case reflected broader issues within law enforcement agencies that were unprepared to deal with serial criminal activity or complex investigations spanning multiple jurisdictions and decades. Each agency involved seemed more concerned with avoiding responsibility than with pursuing comprehensive justice. Local authorities wanted to minimize publicity that would damage the area's tourism economy. State police were overwhelmed by the scope of evidence, and federal agents were reluctant to invest resources in a case where the primary perpetrator was beyond prosecution. Margaret's role in the official investigation became increasingly marginalized as professional investigators took control of the case. Her extensive research and documentation were acknowledged but set aside in favor of proper investigative procedures that often duplicated work she had already completed. The woman who had sacrificed years of her life to uncover the truth found herself treated as a witness rather than as the detective whose persistence had made justice possible for dozens of families. The official response to the Thompson discovery demonstrated how institutional failures could compound the original crimes by denying victims' families the thorough investigation and public accountability they deserved. It would take additional years and continued pressure from Margaret and the families to achieve even partial justice for Thomas Crane's victims. The truth had been uncovered, but the fight for justice was just beginning. The transformation of the Thompson cabin from a family retreat into the center of a national media sensation began in the summer of 1976, when wire services picked up the story of the mountain tunnel discovery. Within weeks, the quiet mountain community of Cedar Ridge found itself overrun by reporters, television crews, and morbid curiosity seekers who came to gawk at the property where decades of disappearances had finally been explained. The media attention that Margaret had hoped would pressure authorities into thorough investigation instead created a circus atmosphere that complicated the search for justice and turned her family's tragedy into public entertainment. The early media coverage focused on the sensational aspects of the discovery rather than the systematic failures that had allowed the crimes to continue undetected. Headlines like "House of Horrors in the Mountains" and "Cabin Built Over Secret Torture Chambers" transformed the complex story of institutional negligence and one woman's persistent investigation into lurid entertainment that satisfied public fascination with true crime while obscuring the serious issues at stake. Margaret found herself portrayed alternatively as a heroic amateur detective or as an obsessed woman whose mental state had led her to misinterpret natural phenomena as evidence of criminal activity. The impact on the local community was immediate and devastating. Cedar Ridge had depended on tourism and outdoor recreation for much of its economy, and the association with serial murder threatened to destroy the peaceful mountain image that attracted visitors and seasonal residents. Local business owners who had initially been supportive of the investigation now saw Margaret as a threat to their livelihoods, and the warm welcome the Thompson family had once received turned to cold hostility from people who blamed them for bringing unwanted attention to their community. Dorothy Walsh at the local library found herself besieged by reporters seeking background information about Thomas Crane and the historical disappearances. Her cooperation with Margaret's research now seemed like a betrayal to neighbors who felt their privacy and community reputation had been sacrificed to satisfy the curiosity of outsiders. "We knew something wasn't right about Thomas," she admitted to reporters, "but we figured it was his business as long as he left everyone else alone. We never imagined anything like this." The statement reflected the willful blindness that had enabled Crane's activities to continue undetected for decades. The Thompson family bore the brunt of both media attention and community resentment. Their cabin became a tourist destination for people who drove hours to take photographs of the property and speculate about the horrors that had occurred there. Robert was forced to take extended leave from his job in Denver as reporters tracked him to his workplace, and the children faced classmates who had seen their family's story sensationalized on television news programs. The mountain retreat that had once represented escape from urban pressures now epitomized the complete loss of privacy and normalcy. Margaret's relationship with the media proved particularly complex and frustrating. Reporters were interested in her story, but only insofar as it fit narrative templates they could easily package for public consumption. Her years of methodical research and analysis were reduced to sound bites about a mother's intuition or amateur detective work, descriptions that minimized both her intelligence and her dedication to uncovering the truth. When she attempted to discuss the broader issues of institutional failure and systematic cover-ups, editors preferred human interest angles that personalized the story while avoiding uncomfortable questions about official responsibility. The victims' families found themselves caught between gratitude for the answers they had finally received and frustration with the way their loved ones' stories were being commercialized. Sarah Hendrick's sister appreciated learning her sister's fate after 30 years of uncertainty, but she was appalled by television programs that used Sarah's photograph alongside dramatic recreations that emphasized gruesome speculation over factual reporting. "Sarah becomes just another dead girl in their horror story," she complained. "They never talk about who she was when she was alive, what she meant to our family, what we lost when she was taken from us." The commercial exploitation of the story began almost immediately. Publishers approached Margaret with offers for book deals that would sensationalize her investigation. True crime television shows requested permission to film at the property, and entrepreneurs developed plans for murder tours that would bring visitors to see the cabin where so many victims had met their fate. Margaret's refusal to participate in the commercialization of her discovery earned her criticism from some media outlets that portrayed her as uncooperative and possibly unstable. The media circus also complicated the ongoing official investigation by creating pressure for quick answers and dramatic revelations rather than the careful forensic work required to identify victims and understand the full scope of Crane's activities. Law enforcement officials found themselves managing public relations as much as evidence analysis, and the need to provide regular updates to hungry reporters sometimes conflicted with investigative best practices. Evidence that should have been processed methodically was rushed through analysis to satisfy media deadlines and public curiosity. Most destructively, the media attention attracted amateur investigators and conspiracy theorists who developed elaborate theories about the case that often contradicted established facts. Internet forums and true crime enthusiasts created alternative narratives that portrayed Margaret as everything from a psychic who had received supernatural guidance to a murderer who had planted evidence to cover her own crimes. These wild theories undermined public understanding of the actual evidence and made it easier for officials to dismiss legitimate criticism of their investigative methods. By the end of 1976, Margaret realized that media attention had become another obstacle to justice rather than a tool for holding officials accountable. The serious questions she had raised about institutional failures were being overshadowed by sensational speculation about torture chambers and buried secrets. The fight for justice would require sustained pressure and careful documentation rather than dramatic headlines and television appearances. The circus would eventually move on to other stories, but the damage to both the community and the pursuit of justice would prove lasting. The years following the initial media frenzy surrounding the Thompson cabin discovery settled into a pattern of institutional neglect and public forgetfulness that allowed officials to quietly shelve one of the most significant serial crime cases in Colorado history. By 1978, the television crews had moved on to other stories. The reporters had found more current mysteries to investigate, and the families of victims found themselves once again fighting for attention in a system that seemed designed to avoid difficult questions about how Thomas Crane had operated undetected for nearly 3 decades. Margaret Thompson's transformation from reluctant investigator to persistent advocate marked the beginning of what would become a lifelong crusade for justice. While her family attempted to rebuild their normal lives in Denver, Margaret continued to spend weekends at the cabin, now monitoring the official investigation with the same intensity she had once devoted to uncovering the initial evidence. Her detailed records of investigative missteps, bureaucratic delays, and prosecutorial decisions would eventually become a damning archive of institutional failure that spanned multiple agencies and administrations. The forensic analysis of evidence from the tunnel system proceeded at a glacial pace that frustrated families and raised questions about official priorities. DNA analysis, still an emerging technology in the late 1970s, was applied inconsistently and often delayed by budget constraints and jurisdictional disputes between agencies. Bodies that Margaret's investigation had located were sometimes left unexamined for months, while officials debated which agency had responsibility for processing evidence from crimes that had occurred across state lines and multiple decades. Sheriff Jim Bradley's handling of the case became increasingly defensive as questions mounted about why his department had dismissed earlier reports of suspicious activity around Thomas Crane's property. Internal documents later revealed that the sheriff's office had received at least 3 complaints about strange noises and suspicious lights near the cabin between 1965 and 1968, but none had been adequately investigated. Bradley's public statements consistently minimized these oversights, while emphasizing the challenges of investigating crimes that had occurred before modern forensic techniques were available. The state police investigation, under Detective Ray Morrison's leadership, focused primarily on identifying victims and determining causes of death, rather than exploring broader questions about how Crane had selected targets or whether he had worked with accomplices. This narrow approach suited officials who wanted to contain the scope of the investigation, but it left crucial questions unanswered and failed to provide families with the comprehensive accounting they had been promised. Morrison's early retirement in 1979 effectively ended any hope of a thorough state-level investigation. Federal involvement, which families had hoped would bring resources and expertise to bear on the case, proved equally disappointing. FBI agent Patricia Collins conducted a competent but limited investigation that documented Crane's activities without exploring the broader implications of how such an extensive criminal operation had remained undetected. Her final report, classified for reasons that were never adequately explained, apparently concluded that Crane had worked alone and that his death had ended the threat to public safety. This conclusion contradicted physical evidence suggesting that the tunnel system had been accessed and maintained by multiple people over many years. The victims' families organized themselves into an advocacy group that pressured officials for more thorough investigations and public accountability. Led by Sarah Hendricks' sister Martha, now Martha Hendricks Powell, the group met monthly to share information and coordinate efforts to keep their loved ones' cases in the public eye. Their persistence uncovered additional evidence of official neglect, including missing files, destroyed records, and investigators who had been transferred or reassigned whenever they showed interest in pursuing uncomfortable lines of inquiry. Margaret's role within the family's advocacy group evolved from that of the person who had discovered the evidence to a researcher and organizer who helped families navigate bureaucratic obstacles and media indifference. Her teaching background proved valuable in analyzing official documents and identifying inconsistencies in various agencies' accounts of their investigative efforts. More importantly, her emotional investment in seeing justice done provided a level of commitment that sustained the group through years of frustration and official stonewalling. The community of Cedar Ridge gradually adapted to living with the knowledge that their peaceful mountain enclave had harbored one of the region's most prolific serial killers. Tourism recovered as the immediate media attention faded, though the Thompson cabin remained a source of local controversy and occasional pilgrimages by true crime enthusiasts. Some residents continued to blame Margaret for disrupting their community's tranquility, while others privately acknowledged that her investigation had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted the area for decades. The cabin itself became a burden that the Thompson family could neither use nor easily sell. The property's association with the crimes made it unmarketable to most buyers, while the ongoing investigation kept it under periodic official scrutiny that complicated any attempts at disposal. Robert and Margaret found themselves maintaining a property they could no longer enjoy, paying taxes on land that held only painful memories and unfulfilled hopes for justice. By the mid-1980s, it became clear that the official investigation had effectively ended without achieving the comprehensive resolution that victims' families deserved. Key questions remained unanswered. How had Crane selected his victims? Had he worked with accomplices who were still alive? Were there additional victims whose disappearances had never been reported? The tunnel system continued to yield evidence sporadically, but without sustained investigative attention, these discoveries were catalogued and stored rather than analyzed for their broader implications. Margaret's documentation of the case had evolved into a comprehensive archive that included not only evidence from the tunnel system, but also records of official misconduct, media distortions, and the various ways that institutions had failed both victims and their families. This archive would prove crucial decades later, when changing technology and renewed investigative interest would finally provide opportunities for the justice that had been so long delayed. The silence that settled over the case reflected the broader challenge of achieving accountability for crimes that implicated not just individual perpetrators, but also the systems that had enabled their activities to continue undetected. The summer of 2009 marked the 40th anniversary of Thomas Crane's death and the end of what had been the most extensive cold case investigation in Colorado history. Margaret Thompson, now 72 years old, had spent over 3 decades fighting for justice, while watching her hair turn grey and her body age under the weight of persistent advocacy that had consumed most of her adult life. The Thompson cabin remained in the family, though it had been years since anyone had spent a night there, serving instead as a monument to questions that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. The breakthrough that would finally provide closure came from an unexpected source, a retired mining engineer named David Chen, who had been researching historical mining operations in the area as part of a university geology project. Chen's ground-penetrating radar survey of old mining sites detected anomalies near the Thompson property that suggested additional underground structures beyond the tunnel system that had been discovered in 1976. His academic interest in historical mining techniques led him to contact Margaret about accessing the property for further research, inadvertently setting in motion the investigation's final chapter. Chen's advanced equipment revealed what 40 years of official investigation had missed: a secondary tunnel system that connected to natural caves extending nearly 2 miles into the mountainside. This discovery explained how Thomas Crane had been able to dispose of evidence so completely, and suggested that his operation had been even more extensive than anyone had imagined. The secondary tunnels had been sealed with sophisticated engineering that had prevented their detection by the primitive equipment available in the 1970s. More significantly, Chen's survey detected what appeared to be a large chamber approximately half a mile from the cabin that showed signs of recent human activity. The discovery prompted the first comprehensive official investigation in over 20 years, led by FBI agent Sarah Martinez, whose specialty in cold cases and advanced forensic techniques brought new hope to families who had waited decades for answers. Martinez's team included specialists in underground crime scenes and anthropologists experienced in recovering remains from complex burial sites. The exploration of the extended tunnel system in late 2009 uncovered evidence that fundamentally changed understanding of the case. Personal belongings and human remains found in the distant chambers indicated that Crane's activities had continued much longer than previously believed, possibly extending into the early 1980s, more than a decade after his supposed death in 1969. This discovery suggested either that Crane had faked his death and continued operating, or that accomplices had maintained his criminal enterprise long after his demise. The most shocking revelation came from documentation found in a sealed container in the deepest chamber. Detailed records that Thomas Crane had kept of his activities, including photographs, victim profiles, and what appeared to be financial records, suggesting that his operation had been part of a larger criminal network. The records indicated connections to similar operations in other states and suggested that the disappearances in Colorado had been part of a coordinated trafficking network that had operated for decades across multiple jurisdictions. DNA evidence from the newly discovered remains, analyzed with techniques unavailable in the 1970s, identified victims from as far away as California and Texas, confirming that Crane's reach had extended far beyond the local disappearances that had initially brought him to Margaret's attention. The sophisticated nature of the operation, evidenced by the extensive tunnel system and careful record-keeping, suggested professional criminal organization rather than the work of a deranged individual acting alone. Agent Martinez's investigation also uncovered evidence of official corruption that explained some of the bureaucratic resistance Margaret had encountered over the decades. Several law enforcement officials who had been involved in the original investigation had financial connections to businesses that would have been damaged by thorough investigation of the case. While no criminal charges were filed due to statutes of limitations, the revelation provided context for the institutional failures that had frustrated families for so many years. The final phase of the investigation, completed in 2011, ultimately identified remains of 47 victims spanning from 1947 to 1982, making Thomas Crane one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The extended timeline confirmed that either Crane had survived much longer than official records indicated, or that his network had included accomplices who continued his work after his documented death. The question would never be fully resolved, as key suspects had themselves died in the intervening decades. Margaret Thompson lived to see the comprehensive resolution she had fought for throughout her adult life. The official acknowledgement of the scope of Crane's crimes and the institutional failures that had enabled them provided validation for her decades of advocacy. She died peacefully in 2013, knowing that her persistence had finally brought some measure of justice to dozens of families who had waited generations for answers about their missing loved ones. The Thompson cabin was finally sold in 2014 to the state of Colorado, which converted the property into a memorial park dedicated to victims of unsolved crimes. The tunnel system was sealed permanently, but a small museum on the site tells the story of Margaret Thompson's investigation and honors the memory of those who disappeared in the shadow of the mountains that had kept their secrets for so long. The case became a landmark study in both criminal investigation and the power of civilian persistence to overcome institutional indifference. Margaret's methods and documentation provided a model for cold case investigations, while her story demonstrated that justice, however delayed, remained possible for those willing to fight for it across decades of frustration and resistance. The mountains had finally given up their dead, and the silence that had protected evil for so long was broken by the voices of those who refused to let the disappeared be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Margaret Thompson's story. See you in the next video.